Welcome to Blackalloy. What you're viewing here is a Blackalloy unit that's still disassembled, and what I'm going to show you is how I typically would put it together. This quill happens to have the clean room seals, so they are a little bit more rigid in design than the seals that require lubricated air. What I'm going to do is this rear housing actually has a cylinder gasket in it already, and it has an O-ring. I take the shaft seal with one snap ring on it, insert it in, flip it over, and then what I do is I put the snap ring on the back side. That takes care of that. Now, what I'll do is I'll actually put the cylinder on. Make sure it's good and clean inside. And next, what I'm going to do is install the quill into the cylinder itself. What I do is I initially load it so it's on an angle. This makes it easier because what I want to do is walk the remaining portion of the seal into the cylinder. And I use a small flat-bladed screwdriver that has all the sharp edges removed. And typically what I do is I walk it around like so. And then what will happen is that'll just drop in. Now from there, all you have to do is tap it, okay? And that should go on. Because there is a chamfer on the front of that smaller tube inside, so it's kind of a lead-in, because there's a seal internally also, and you have to pay attention to the direction of that seal when installing it in the back of the quill. Here, I'll show you again, and that's the seal that's in here. There's a seal, and the open portion has to be facing up to the rear because you want that to seal because there's air pressure on the back side. So here again, I put this in here. I load it like that on an angle till I get that seal, and I'm applying slight amount of force in a downward direction. There. Now when I go to put the front housing on, what I do is I slide that down, and there's two lips in this rod wiper in here. Take the small flat blade again, walk that around the edge of the quill while applying a slight downward force constantly when you're doing that. And then once I get it over that, okay, I have to tap it over this. There's a groove in the OD of the quill, so I have to get the seal over that groove. I just tap it on like that. It's on. Then typically next, I would put the 4 tie rod screws with lock washers in. Just in this portion of the assembly, you just want to snug them up a little bit, and you want to tighten them in a crisscross pattern. This way you tighten them evenly. And what we typically do when we do finally tighten them, we put them down on a flat granite work surface, and we use C-clamps to hold it down. This way, then we go back and finally tighten these in, like I said, the crisscross pattern. Now what I'll show you is, here's a spline bushing with the bearing loaded onto it, with the snap rings on both sides. Now, sometimes you can't, depending upon the clearance in the housing, you may not be able to get this in all the way, but that's fine. You can partially install it like this. For illustration purposes, I don't have any grease on the bearings for the assembly. This is the 3-piece thrust and needle roller bearing that goes behind the flange that's on the spindle. Insert that in. Now, what you want to do is, of course, you got to find the spline bushing, the opening in it, and you want to tap that. You're going to have to tap that in. Now, also, I just happen to have the stop collar here, and in every quill that goes out, there's a small, I don't know if you can see it or not, there's a small countersink in that groove, and what we typically do is that needs to be lined up with the set screw hole that is in the stop collar. And what we do is we actually set that set screw into this. This way that collar cannot move. Under repeated, constantly stroking back and forth, we have seen these collars move until we started doing that. And then once you have that in place, now I can't put it up because all the way up against the front face because these screws are still above the face of the front housing. I'll just snug them up so we can just so I can show you this. Assemble that on there, and that portion of the bearing is already on. Then I take the other 3 pieces. There's a thick washer, the center bearing portion of the bearing, and the thin washer. The thin washer goes to the front, up against the front bearing housing that we have here. The thick washer goes against the flange that's on the spindle. Now what I'm going to do is take this bearing housing and install it. The seal is already installed, and there's also a lip in here, and you have to pay attention to this. And what we typically do is, here again, we'll take a small flat blade screwdriver and walk it around until that front bearing housing is on. And then you can install your 2 bolts. Now, typically what I would recommend with this stop collar is this, you don't want to tighten the set screw up completely. You just want to have it set into the countersink without locking it up, and then go back, and on the opposite side you have the Allen cap screw. Just snug that up so this collar is not loose, because what you want to do then is go back, and you'll probably notice that there's going to be a gap. This happens to have a rectangular block, but we also have it with the round front bearing housing that looks typically like this one. They get installed the same way. And then what you can do is you can go and install the 2 1032 by 1.5" bolts into it, and you can basically tighten that up, okay? And this will set your preload on the bearing. And what I normally recommend is you rotate the spindle. Make sure that it's rotating freely before you go and tighten up this screw again. You don't want to have the preload so high on the bearing that you're going to prematurely wear the bearing out. So sometimes when it's a little too tight, even when you have this after, all I do is just back that off until the screw is essentially just basically hand tight, and that will relieve the load on the bearing, and you'll see that the bearing rotates a little bit easier. And then you can go back and lock this up. And that's pretty much, putting the unit together. If you have any questions, call me. It's 201-475-9300. Thank you.